If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Last week's veto session at the Missouri Capitol was not supposed to be particularly eventful, but a dust-up around overrides of Governor Mike Parson's line-item budget vetoes exposed tensions within the Senate Republican caucus. And in the case of GOP Senator Mike Moon, the episode also prompted frustration toward powerful Republican political figures.
Now we're saying, because of some tradition, we're not going to pay him back. He needs to be paid.
On this edition of Politically Speaking, St. Louis Public Radio's Sarah Kellogg and I explain why this veto session scrapple could have fallout into the 2022 session. And we bring in Republican Senators Bob Onder and Caleb Rowden to get their perspectives on what happened and why it mattered. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
We have to talk about things that matter to people.
I've tried to bring that same aggressive iconoclast style with me to the United States Senate.
I think my district is a model for the state.
We put Missourians first.
You just kind of have to find the common ground with people.
I believe that this district deserves someone who represents their values.
After I came back to St. Louis, I started thinking that I could have a bigger role on the change that I wanted to make.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum. Joining me from Jefferson City, she is St. Louis Public Radio's State House reporter,
Sarah Kellogg.
And we're going to be talking about veto session and particularly what happened in the Missouri Senate. This is a different show than we typically have done on Politically Speaking. We're going to have two guests right after this summation of what happened. Senator Bob Onder of Lake St. Louis will be the first guest, and Senate Majority Leader Caleb Rowden of Columbia will be the second. Sarah, why are we even talking about veto session? Like, I thought this was supposed to be like a sleepy, uneventful 24 hours. From reading your coverage, I was dead wrong on that.
Well, so was I, and so was who I talked to. Yeah, it was supposed to be, typically, when the majority of the legislature and the governor are the same party, normally it's a quiet veto session. There aren't really many attempts to override, and we knew going in that there were going to be some House overrides, and that did indeed happen. But when I got over to the Senate, pretty much everything changed, and it all was over who has the right to bring up a bill for an override.
Now, to piggyback on some of your points, the House ended up overriding several of Governor Mike Parson's line item vetoes. And when they got to the Senate Appropriations Chairman Dan Hegeman, who handled the budget bills in the Senate, did not want to override them for various reasons. And what ended up causing a lot of consternation was what Senator Mike Moon of Lawrence County did. Sarah, what exactly did Senator Moon do?
Well, what he did was basically cause the Senate to come to a standstill for several hours. And so, normally it is practice of the bill holder to be the one to bring up an override veto in the Senate. So in this case, like you said, it would have been Senator Dan Hegeman to bring up appropriation related vetoes. But Senator Mike Moon instead made the motion, and Lieutenant Governor Mike Kehoe did not recognize him for the motion. And that caused kind of immediate kind of disbelief that his motion wouldn't be recognized. And it was cited that Senate tradition is to why. And so, there was a point of order called. They called Senate President Pro Tem Dave Schatz to issue a ruling on the point of order. Schatz sided with Kehoe, and that just kind of led to an hours-long debate over who has the right to bring up a veto override. And actually, we have a clip from Senator Bill Eigel, who spoke after Schatz ruled in favor of Kehoe's decision.
What should have been a relatively straightforward day with a vote on a couple minor items in a $37 billion budget has now been brought to the brink of moving the chamber to a place where a member of the executive branch is able to stifle members of this chamber based on his own personal interpretation of the traditions of this body.
But obviously, other senators had a different opinion about what happened, Sarah. What did, for example, Senator Dan Hegeman say?
Yeah, so there were people who pretty much thought that this is, there's an importance to continue the traditions and the ways that the Senate has operated. And so, Hegeman, though he did not bring up the bills initially for an override after these hours of debate, Hegeman himself did eventually, in a way to kind of circumvent who has the right to bring up a bill, because there were at least 2 bills that senators wanted to bring up overrides for in the Senate. He said he pretty much had never been more disrespected. We have a clip from him talking as well.
We have decided to cast aside those traditions, those rules, as we continue to do. Like this last session, we just continue to cast aside all these rules and regulations because we want to pursue some other agendas out there and get before the spotlights and be seen around the world.
Well, I'm not exactly sure that the entire world is watching the Missouri Senate, but as somebody who does, first of all, I've never seen Senator Hegeman that upset before. Second of all, I think that the reason I'm interested in this topic is not necessarily about the substance of the line item veto, but how this is really showcasing a very stark and often personal divide between people who are considered part of the leadership of the Senate and more conservative Republicans like Senator Moon, who have been agitating against leadership on a whole host of other issues. Where do we go from here after this? Is this a preview of what's to come in a legislative session that's going to have a whole host of issues that could split the Republican caucus in the Senate?
I mean, that's the question, right? It's something that we'll have to see further down the road. But, as Hegeman, mentioned, he alluded to the political spotlight, kind of almost alluding to political gain, wanting their time in the spotlight. So it seems like this is a problem that's been persisting. I know I'm the new person, but, you can even just, watching my first veto session, you can kind of see that there is this tension here of leadership and those maybe wanting to shake things up a little bit. Obviously I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't rule it out.
Well, we're going to get into this and bring you the perspectives of both sides of this fractious debate. Right after this quick intermission, we will hear from Senator Bob Onder, who represents a portion of St. Charles County in the Senate. And then later on the show, you will hear from Senate Majority Leader Caleb Rowden, a Republican from Columbia. We'll be right back.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
And we're back on Politically Speaking, and joining us is the first of 2 guests on this show. He is the state senator for Missouri's 2nd District.
Bob Onder.
And the 2nd District encompasses portions of St. Charles County. So walk me through this, Senator. What was your reaction to Senator Moon's motion about not being recognized for his veto override?
Well, yeah, Jason, as you know, this issue centered around a line item veto that the governor made. It was specifically $150,000 to right a wrong that our tax collector, the Missouri Department of Revenue, had perpetrated against some small businesses in Missouri. At a time when they're already strapped with COVID, they inappropriately reinterpreted the tax law to penalize these businesses. And Representative Jim Murphy in the House made a motion to override the governor on this particular line item veto, and it passed the House by a vote of 150 to 2. And it came over to the Senate, and Senator Mike Moon wanted to make the motion to bring forward that override and to restore this money to these deserving taxpayers. Well, when Senator Mike Moon made that motion, the presiding officer, Lieutenant Governor Mike Keogh, refused to recognize Senator Moon. And when Senator Moon asked why, the lieutenant governor said, "Tradition of the Senate." Now, I have the greatest respect for traditions of the Senate, but the traditions of the Senate do not override the Missouri Constitution, and they do not override the rules of the Missouri Senate. And furthermore, then the lieutenant governor doesn't have that kind of power. In the Missouri Supreme Court case involving Lieutenant Governor Bill Phelps, it's very clear that the lieutenant governor can preside whenever he wants to, but he has to follow the rules of the Senate. I don't think Mike Keogh did that when he refused to recognize Senator Moon.
And has this tradition of the idea of the handler of the bill having the power to overturn it, has this been a contested issue before? Why has this not been been brought up until now?
Well, I think for some reason there was this narrative we're just not. I mean, in the past, override votes have been discussed, debated, and taken. Of course, Governor Nixon was overridden many times, but there was this narrative that, we do not want to override a Republican governor. Well, no one's perfect. We don't have a king. We don't have a monarch. We don't have a caliph. We have a governor. And more importantly, we have a system of checks and balances. I think it's utterly absurd that we're pulling out of our hat this narrative about a tradition of the Senate to, first of all, deprive the citizens of the state of the representation that the 170,000 people who are represented by Senator Moon and the 210,000 people who are represented by me in Western St. Charles County, to deprive us of a voice in the budget process. So I think that's wrong. I think it's a violation of our separation of powers. And if somehow this is some unwritten rule or tradition, I think it needs to change now or change next session.
There was another narrative that was being put forth by some of your colleagues that didn't like what you were doing, and that you and Senator Moon and Senator Bratton were only doing this to bring attention to yourselves for your further political aspirations. For context, Senator Moon is running for Congress. Senator Bratton may run for Congress. And the last time you were on the show, you mentioned that you have not ruled out running for something in the future. What do you make of that? Because that was a pretty startling accusation to throw at all of you.
Well, I asked Senator Rowden to give specific details because it's been rumored and certainly Senator Rowden has given many hints that he might run for the 4th congressional district seat, represented now by Vicky Hartzler. So I wanted to know specifically, was there a particular race and a particular center he was referring to? And of course, he kind of squirmed out of that one. So because right now I am more than happy. I was more than happy to say that I have no plans to run for Congress in 2022. And if, Senator Rowden wanted to engage in that discussion, which apparently he didn't, I was going to invite him to pledge not to run for Congress in 2022. But I don't think he wanted to go there. So he could dish it out, but he couldn't take it. When I questioned him what he meant, by the way, it took him about 5 or 10 minutes to get back to the floor when I inquired of him. He didn't want to talk about specifics. But no, Jason, look, I will always look for opportunities to serve the people of the state of Missouri in whatever way God calls me to do. I don't think that means a congressional run in 2022. But believe me, Senator Rowden knows better than anyone that I am willing to speak out and buck leadership when I need to, when I think they're doing the wrong thing.
Ultimately, this ended up with Senator Hageman bringing up the bills for veto override consideration, even though he wasn't for it. Is this something you would like to see changed? Is there a plan to introduce new rules to modify how the veto session goes, or does it not really matter in this case because it wasn't successful? Like Senator Hageman brought it up and the overrides failed, so it doesn't really seem like it would have mattered either way, basically.
Yeah. Well, the votes on those things, Jason, were on those line items were very surprising. So what happened in both cases is that every Democrat and the members of the conservative caucus sided with the taxpayers over the tax collectors, the Department of Revenue. We sided with kids over child sex offenders. And in both cases, a majority of the Republican caucus, they preferred to not override the governor, and they sided with the tax collector over small businessmen. They sided with the child sex offenders over the kids. I was really surprised and appalled by those votes. But whether we need to change the rules, I don't think we do. I think this so-called tradition that Lieutenant Governor Keogh was citing and that Senator Rowden was talking about in his little dissertation at the end of the session, it's found nowhere in our rule book. It's specifically contradicted by the Missouri Constitution, Article 3, Section 32. And I don't think we need a change in the rules, but I do think we need to apply the existing rules fairly, which unfortunately Senate leadership didn't seem to want to do last Wednesday.
Now, Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason why people voted against the Lincoln County situation is it was said that there's going to be federal money that will pay to combat sex offenders there. Sarah, am I right on that? I want to make sure I'm getting the context right on that.
It was mentioned there was kind of a grant option. Now the House, when the House overrode it, they said, the grants will not work. And that wasn't, Senator Riddle had the opposite view and was for the grants.
So, but that seems like when you say like your colleagues were siding with sex offenders, it doesn't really seem like it says the whole story. It seems like there's going to be money eventually to fight that problem in Lincoln County. What would you say to that?
Yeah. Oh, well, Jason, I heard that argument that Senator Riddle and Senator Hageman seem to buy into. I would just point out that is utter nonsense. Yes, there's a grant. I believe it's $2.2 million, but all 114 counties in the state of Missouri are eligible for it. And it's my understanding already a dozen have applied for it. So Lincoln County would just be one of 114 counties applying for that limited sum of money. And it has to go through the whole federal grant application process, which could take, I don't know, months, I don't know, maybe years. Whereas if we had done the right thing and overridden that veto last Wednesday, I believe the treasurer of the state of Missouri could have written that check to the Lincoln County Task Force the next morning. So the idea that somehow you go through this complicated federal grant application process and the prosecutors fighting child sex offense cases would get the money faster, it's just absurd. It's wrong. But that narrative was made up to justify this vote, which ultimately seemed to be just about not wanting to overrule a Republican governor on a line item veto.
Will some of these, these issues that were discussed, these tensions, will they kind of be carried over into the regular session? Is there going to be kind of a financial priority to make sure what didn't get override to be in next year's budget?
Well, I think, Sarah, that those things should be in next year's budget. I hope that the child sex offense task forces do find a way to get funded between now and then. But yeah, I think it would be definitely should be a priority in next year's budget. But as far as will these tensions carry over, what we are being asked to swallow in the Missouri Senate is that 1/3 of senators are on the Senate Appropriations Committee. 2/3 of senators are not. We're being told that, number one, there should be no floor amendments to to budgets in the Missouri Senate at all. There are lots of floor amendments to the budget in the House. We're also being asked to say that when a particular line item that a senator cares about is vetoed, that senator should have no power to override that veto. Essentially, 2/3 of senators, and by extension, 2/3 of the citizens of the state of Missouri, have no influence over the budget in the Missouri Senate. That is absolutely wrong. And if that is what the appropriations chair and leadership are asking, let's face it, it gives them more power. So they like that a lot. By all means, there are going to be a lot of budget tensions in the coming session. But I think the principle of separation of powers, the clear language of our Constitution, would dictate that we need to change this, whether it's a tradition or an unwritten rule. That's nonsense. It disenfranchises citizens in 2/3 of the state of Missouri, and I think it's absolutely wrong.
Well, Senator, thank you so much for joining us and providing your perspective. Right after this break, we will hear from Senate Majority Leader Caleb Rowden to get his take on the Senate situation. We'll be right back. And we're back on Politically Speaking, and joining us, he is the Senate Majority Leader. He's joining us from beautiful Boone County, Missouri.
It's Caleb Rowden.
Thank you, Senator, for joining us and providing your perspective on what both Sarah and I found to be a pretty revealing episode in the annals of the Missouri Senate. When you talked with Sarah right before the veto session, you more or less said that you were anticipating a quiet session, and it was not a quiet veto session. What are your overall thoughts about the whole situation with you and several of your Republican colleagues a week after the fact?
Yeah, I think people try to make more of these things maybe sometimes than there really is. I think the one thing you have to keep in mind is when we're not in session for 3 or 4 months, and then we know we're not going to be in session for another couple months. I described it after the fact to someone else as, everybody's got to get they've got to fit their 6 months of headlines into one day, right? And so, there's a little bit of that. I think it was a legitimate the conversation I had with Senator Moon on the floor, and the conversation that I had with Senator Bratton, who had a desire to make the motion on one of the other lines. It wasn't that I didn't support actually either one of them. It was kind of just the bigger picture conversation of how we treat others in the Senate, and particularly folks in our own party, as it relates to taking over their bills or taking their motions from them. And that's not a fun conversation to have, because you may get painted as the bad guy in the public. It's not you're doing the right thing, because in my view, I was doing the right thing because it's the right thing, not because I'm making any friends doing it. And so, it is what it is. I don't dislike or hold any ill will against any of those guys. I just think we got stuck in a weird moment, and all the eyes and ears were tuned our way, and so it became a little bigger thing.
And kind of what in general was your initial reaction, your later reaction to Senator Moon making that motion to override that line item veto?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation I had with him, the conversation I had with Senator Onder on the floor, really kind of captured what I viewed to be the reality of the moment that we were in that, they would claim that because there is no guidance as it relates to someone else being able to make the motion in place of the bill handler, which is something, again, that has never happened in the history of the Senate, in the absence of any sort of guidance that they should be able to do it. Well, I would contend that in the absence of guidance, the traditions and things that we've adhered to for the better part of a century take precedent. And to take that a step further, if there is any ambiguity in moments like that, the president pro tem has the final say, right? Because he's the guy that gets to rule on points of order. And so that point of order happened, and he made it clear where he was at. So I mean, I think the notion that Lieutenant Governor Kehoe was out of bounds or doing some going way out of his way to grab any sort of power or anything like that is foolish, because Senator Schatz had the final say, and agreed with the position of Lieutenant Governor Kehoe. So again, I think we always have those moments. It just happened to be in kind of a one day sort of deal that probably makes it a little bigger deal than it would have been otherwise.
And in a similar way, kind of what is lost when these procedures and these rules kind of aren't followed? Because, the reaction was one of maybe disbelief that Kehoe didn't recognize, Senator Moon's motion, and kind of what is lost when those procedures, those traditions.
Yeah, well, I'll make 2 points, and there were 2 kind of separate moments of consternation. The first point, and I will take and Dave and I will take Senator Schatz and I will take the blame for. There were 2 kind of ways that you could go about it. Lieutenant Governor Kehoe could have done what he did and just say you're not recognized, or he also could have restated the motion, and then there could have been a point of order. And you could have gone about that. So, they had 2 separate issues, one of which was the way that it came to be known that it wasn't acceptable for Senator Moon to make that motion. But, to answer the question, there are a ton of, and we learn them when we get elected to the Senate, and, you have former senators. In my case, it was Peter Kinder and Jim Mathewson and Victor Callahan and somebody else, I can't remember who else, who come in and kind of talk to you about unwritten rules. And there's a ton of unwritten rules in the Senate that, a lot of them are known, and then some of them are not. This one is one that's pretty well known. So you have to protect those. I do think everybody uses the moniker that you don't want to turn into the House, but they always use it when it's advantageous to their kind of position. And so in this case, it is a situation where, it is a distinction between the House, and there's nothing wrong with the House. We're just different. And so I think we need to protect those differences, and we need to protect what makes the Senate what it is.
So what do you think is the reasoning to keep some of these processes intact? From Senator Moon's perspective, he was trying to right a very specific wrong that had occurred to people that he'd been talking with, involving, I guess, wedding venues and tax collections. For people that are affected by this particular issue, they may see this discussion about Senate traditions and be like, well, that's great, but I want this issue resolved, and this is standing in the way of it being resolved.
There's a lot of stuff that I want that I don't get from time to time, and I'm one of the more powerful people in the Senate, according to some. So, I think just to say that if I don't get my way, I'm going to run over Senate tradition. I think that's not good, for one. Secondly, I think you have to look at these things in context. And in the case of Senator Moon, and his issue, one of which I'm incredibly sympathetic to, and one that I definitely agree with, his concern on how it happened to these businesses originally in DOR, kind of stepping outside of their lane. But part of the dollar amount that was being asked for in that $150,000 was related to attorney's fees, and you can't pay attorney's fees out of the statute. You have to pay it out of the legal offense fund. And so I think you always have to look at things in context of being honest about how to functionally get something done. I think the concern or the mistake that some folks in the Missouri Senate make is trying to take shortcuts to get things done faster, when you can actually just go and have conversations and build those relationships, whether it be with the governor in this case not getting that thing vetoed, or finding the appropriate way to get it done and actually getting it done. And so I think that's always there aren't a lot of shortcuts in the Senate because of our rules and because of our kind of the way we've always done things. And so my advice to anybody is don't blow up the Senate because you didn't get your way. Figure out a way to build relationships so that you can actually functionally get done what you want to get done.
So there was a question about whether there was any precedent of the lieutenant governor not calling on somebody, and it brought to mind an episode in 2004, which I was not around for. I just read about it in the Columbia Tribune archives, where a lot of Republicans were standing to be recognized because Democrats were filibustering something. And then Democratic Lieutenant Governor Joe Maxwell just didn't really acknowledge them and allowed the filibuster to happen and for the filibuster to succeed. And I think that led to some rule changes, especially dealing with the previous question, if I'm not mistaken. Do you anticipate there being some sort of rule changes about this? Admittingly, very specific scenario, but one that would kind of clear up ambiguity in the future veto session?
There could be. I mean, I'd say a couple of things. One, Lieutenant Governor Kehoe did not call on Senator Moon, right? So, I mean, I think there's two separate, there's kind of two layers to any sort of inquiry. There is the acknowledgement that the person is seeking recognition, which he clearly did and would always do for anybody. But then the secondary one is to make sure that the motion that he makes is in order. And from our perspective, it wasn't in order. It's not dissimilar to someone making trying to inquire of someone as a previous question motion has been made or something like that. You know, there are moments where people make motions that they are not recognized for. And so, you know, to answer your question, could we maybe make some changes in the rules to further clarify what is acceptable and what is not in veto session? Maybe, but I would contend, you know, treating veto session any differently than regular session probably it doesn't make good sense. The example that I used was the 100 or so line item vetoes that Jay Nixon did in the 2016 or 2015 budget, and the idea that the notion that the minority party could make a motion on 100 line item vetoes is insanity. I don't think that actually is functionally it works, you know. And so again, you have to see these things not in what do I want the world to look like in this particular moment, but what am I asking of the Missouri Senate and how it affects not just now, but well into the future. And so again, I'm not sure anything needs to be changed. I think people know now kind of what the expectation is during veto session. Admittedly, there is some ambiguity and some lack of clarity as to what's acceptable during veto, but I think now, at least for the next year, Senator Schatz has made it clear that, you know, if you're the bill handler or the bill sponsor, you're the one that gets to make the motion.
And, you know, you said earlier kind of maybe this was overblown. A lot of people kind of wanted to get their headlines in one day. Do you see any of this tension that happened carrying over to the general session?
Yeah, I mean, maybe, you know, anything's possible. I think the biggest, at least from my perspective, I can't speak for anybody else. And, you know, there may be people on any given day don't like me personally, but, you know, I don't have anything personal against any of these guys. You know, I know the notion of the conservative caucus and the other folks in the Republican caucus, and then, you know, kind of the tension that exists there. You know, we still agree on a bunch of stuff. We still agree on 80% of the stuff. We still want the state to have lower taxes. We still want, you know, people's Second Amendments to be protected. We still want the state to be the most pro-life state in the country. You know, all those things are pretty clear cut. And so what I have always tried to do, and admittedly I'm not always successful, but have tried to keep, you know, the personal sort of whatever animosity exists that between our kind of factions, that can't be a part of why we do what we do in the Missouri Senate. And so to the greatest extent possible, I'm going to try to make sure that it's not, at least on my side. But, you know, I don't know. I don't know how mad people were, you know, on the other side as we exited last week. So we'll see. If it's not that problem, there'll be, you know, 15 others in January. It's just kind of the way it is.
Well, when I was listening from afar in St. Louis, one of the most striking things that I heard you say, and I'm paraphrasing it here, is that you accuse some people of making a big deal out of this particular override to gain attention for other political offices that they're running for. In the case of Senator Moon, he's running for Congress. Senator Bratton is thinking of running for Congress. Senator Onder has said he wants to run for something else. But you yourself are considered a serious contender to run for the 4th district seat. Couldn't somebody credibly accuse you from now on of using your power as majority leader to, you know, further your own political ambition, since you opened the door to that yourself?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. One, I don't, people are always going to use a platform that they have. I think the way in which some folks went about the theatrics last Wednesday, in some cases the yelling and screaming aimed at the lieutenant governor, who is not even a part of our body. I think that was just out of bounds. I think that was foolish, and I think it was. I think there was another motive there. For me, if I'm going to run for Congress, I'm going to do my very best to make sure that the person who I am now is the person who, is running for Congress and the person who gets elected, to be in Congress. I think this idea that we have to fundamentally change who we are when we decide to run for another office, or that we have to be louder or more boisterous than we would be otherwise. Maybe it resonates in a bubble somewhere, but I do think a vast majority of folks around the state, they just want good, honest, hardworking people, and maybe flashy isn't quite so good these days. I'm sure I'll get accused of any number of things if I decide to run, and that's fine. And we're big boys and we can handle it. But I'm going to make sure that whatever office, if I decide to run for something else, whatever office I seek next, doesn't keep me from, or doesn't force me to be who I'm not, doesn't force me to, just light a match to Senate tradition, because I'm not in Congress. I'm a senator right now, and so it's important for me to make sure that that Senate tradition is respected, and that we leave the place just as good as we found it, if that's at all possible.
Well, Senator, thank you very much for your time, and we'll be following what happens in the Missouri Senate with great interest. That's it for this edition of Politically Speaking. I want to thank both Senators Onder and Rowden for joining us. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. You can follow all of our stories at stlpr.org. Follow me on Twitter at @Rosenbaum. And how can people follow you on Twitter, Sarah, or any other parts of the World Wide Web?
You can mostly find me online on Twitter, which is @Sarah K. Kellogg.
We'll be back next time. Until then, so long.